Before I spent 1,000 hours listening to Spanish content, before I became fluent in the language, I had all these misconceptions about what reaching fluency in a second language would be like. I personally believe if someone truly understands what fluency is and what you can expect once you get there, that the journey to learning a second language will be much, much easier. And that's exactly why I made this video. What's going on, guys? My name's Nick. I founded a comprehensible input website called Lengualytics, and I'm a fluent speaker of the Spanish language. And we're not gonna waste any more time with the intro. We're gonna jump right into the 4 myths. Number 1. Fluency is just translating really fast. Because of what I was taught in school, I assumed fluency just meant the ability to translate from Spanish to English really, really fast. That was the only model I had. So my idea was, you'd hear Spanish, you convert it into English, and you would do that so often and you get so good at it that eventually you'd be lightning quick. You could just do it while you were hearing Spanish being spoken or any language being spoken. And that was fluency. And I believed that for a long time because I think if you only speak one language, it's really hard to conceptualize any other model of how fluency works. But I remember hitting a point when the content I was watching was getting too difficult, and that was around when I was going from beginner stage to intermediate stage. The content was legitimately outpacing me. I would be trying to translate in my head, but by the time I was halfway through that translation, the speaker had moved on to the next point. My brain literally couldn't catch up, and that's when I started to take seriously the ALG comprehensible input idea that you shouldn't be translating in your head as you watch content. And that brought me to the realization that I didn't need to translate faster. Translation itself was the bottleneck. What I didn't understand was to actually reach fluency, you have to cut out the middleman. You can't go from what you're hearing, translating it into your native language, then getting meaning. You have to hear what you're hearing and instantly get the meaning from it. At a certain speed, and definitely in native conversation, your brain just won't be able to translate word for word what you're hearing. And at that point, you have a decision to make. You can either let go of translation and keep improving, or you can plateau. Because if you resist to give up control and you feel like you need to understand every little thing, you're actually actively fighting the way your brain learns languages. But if you can adapt to ambiguity, that's when your fluency can really start to grow. Number 2, fluency means knowing every word. When I got into input-based learning, I still carried over some of my traditional learning tendencies, and one of those tendencies was flashcards. Whenever I'd hear a new word in beginner content, I would go into my flashcard app and I'd record it, write it down, and I'd practice that word until I could master it, until every time I used that flashcard, I could figure out what that word was. Then, once I could recall it instantly, I'd check off that word in my brain and I'd say, okay, I know that word now. But I haven't used flashcards in a while, and I thought it might be the case that if I went back to my old flashcard deck and found some of those words that I had, allegedly mastered, that I allegedly knew, I bet that I probably wouldn't remember all those words, and I was right. I saw a word letrina, empetado, atreverse, which I kind of knew that one, I'd say I had that one 50%. But the point was, those were all words that I had mastered. But yet, I look back 2 years later and I clearly haven't mastered them because I've forgotten them. Why would I have forgotten words that I drilled over and over and over again until I mastered them? Well, the answer is simple. It's because they never came up again. I never needed them. My brain decided they weren't important. Your brain knows what you need to know. It remembers what's important and it throws out what isn't. And you don't really get a vote in that. You can try to brute force it in the short term with flashcards, but in the long run, the words that stick are the words you hear over and over and over again in authentic contexts. Words that have become meaningful to you through experiencing them in situations that you found important to you. Les voy a decir un chiste ahora solo en español porque no quiero que todos entiendan esto. Yo siempre voy a recordar la frase cuatro patas. Y no voy a decirles por qué, pero la gente que habla español van a entender por qué. Anyway, after about 150 hours of listening to Spanish, I had ditched flashcards completely because I realized that fluency wasn't about shoving a dictionary inside your head. It was about becoming comfortable about the things that matter to you, and that's different for everybody. If I can have an hour-long phone call in Spanish where I joke around, I explain things, I debate things, but I don't know how to say the color purple in Spanish, Am I not fluent? In my opinion, the answer is no. That just means I'm a fluent Spanish speaker who doesn't know how to say the color purple. Fluency is not a vocabulary checklist. It's the ability to understand and be understood in real situations. That's why I personally wouldn't stress about trivial things like knowing every color or knowing every number 1 to 100, because those things just don't come up that much. Number 3, fluency will magically appear one day after you study enough. Before I discovered input-based learning, I did traditional learning methods. I did Duolingo. I watched grammar videos on YouTube in English. I was doing all the things they teach you should do when you learn Spanish in high school. But I remember this nagging sensation in the back of my head as I was doing the traditional style of learning. And I just kept thinking to myself, this doesn't really make sense. How many flashcards? How many Duolingo sessions? How many grammar exercises until I can have a fluent conversation with someone who speaks Spanish? I just couldn't see a path to fluency from the exercises I was doing. I was accumulating facts about Spanish, but it all seemed so clinical. It didn't seem to be translating into actual conversation. So I started to cope. I started to tell myself, well, maybe I just won't feel anything, and then one morning I'm gonna wake up like Scrooge on Christmas and be like, oh my God, I'm fluent in Spanish. And I think that a lot of beginners kind of have this cope as well. If you have this cope, write it in the comments, because I'm actually curious. Like, that's kind of how I thought fluency would work. Because I didn't see anything happening. I thought to myself, if I'm gonna become fluent one day, it's gonna happen like in a flash, because I don't feel any more fluent than I felt the last 2 weeks. I intuitively felt that drilling rules and drilling specific phrases couldn't be the whole story of how you learn a language. Then, when I switched to input-based learning and finally got a Dreaming Spanish account, it was really refreshing to see that they were tracking progress in hours, as opposed to something more ephemeral, like lessons or how much grammar you understand. Like, it seemed to be more honest. It felt to me more like the gym. When you talk about growing in the gym, you talk about progressive overload, you talk about volume, time under tension. Those are all easily measurable things that obviously put strain on your muscles enough for them to grow. And if you think of your brain as a muscle, you kind of almost feel like when you're listening to Spanish, that's time under tension. That's you putting in the reps to understand Spanish more and more and more. It was really a reframing for me, a reset, especially when I saw the scale of how many hours you needed. 300 hours to low fluency, 600 hours to a more functional fluency, 1,500 hours to mastery. When I saw those numbers spelled out, everything, I reframed what it was gonna feel like to become fluent. I stopped thinking of fluency as something that you might feel yourself growing in day by day, and I started thinking of it as something you might feel every 20 hours, every 30 hours, every 50 hours, because that was what I was being set up to expect when I see a level roadmap as big as it is in Dreaming Spanish, and I think that's accurate. And I think giving that to people early on is super important, because to me, that feels very honest. It seems to me like traditional language learning classes in Duolingo, what they're really, really not good at is telling you how long until fluency. They just never answer that question to the point where it almost feels like they're avoiding the question because they don't know. It's like, well, I don't know, I guess a million grammar lessons. It's like,
I don't know.
And I think it was nice to finally have a roadmap and see, all right, like this is what it takes to learn a language. Number 4, fluency means you think in the language. I assumed if you could understand Spanish and you can speak Spanish, then you might naturally also be thinking in Spanish. Like my self-narrator would sometimes just slip into Spanish when I wasn't paying attention. But I've listened to 1,000 hours of Spanish, I speak it fluently, I understand it fluently, and I never think in Spanish. Can I think in Spanish? Yes, but it's slow and it's not my default internal narrator setting. Even when I'm speaking Spanish, even kind of when I'm listening to Spanish, I'm still thinking in English. It's really hard to explain if you don't speak a second language, but I can be listening to Spanish, not translating in my head, but having other thoughts about things related to what I'm watching, but they come to me in English. And honestly, at my level, that kind of surprised me. What I've realized is there's a huge difference between fluency and mastery. I think people who are just starting out look to people who are fluent, like people who are fluent look to people who have mastered a language. That's how far apart fluency and mastery are. The reality is, I still make a lot of mistakes when I speak. I still don't understand everything I hear, and that's totally normal because fluency doesn't mean perfection. Fluency means you can live in a language comfortably, but it doesn't mean that second language will be as sharp or as clear as your native tongue. And I think that's important to address because it would have helped me to understand that even people who have spent years and years listening to a language and from the outside looking in seem perfectly competent, perfectly fluent, can talk to anybody they want. It's important to know those people are still learners. Fundamentally. I'm sure as I get further and further along in my Spanish journey, eventually I might start thinking more in Spanish. I might get really, really good at speaking to the point where I make almost no mistakes. But that's not fluency. That's mastery. I only add that last myth because I think it makes fluency seem much more achievable and it kind of strips away some of that unneeded magicalness that surrounds fluency, where people think, oh, they're just aliens who are so smart that can, understand another language, when the reality is we're just learners who are really far along in the process. If you made it this far in the video, that means you probably didn't hate it, and that means you also probably won't hate this video right here, or you might. Anyway, I have a library of comprehensible input on my website called Lengualytics. The link is always in the description. Thank you for watching.